Hi everyone, welcome back to GameMaker Cast. It's Mickey. In this video, we're going to be cloning a Flappy Bird all from scratch. This is not going to be a multi-video tutorial. Everything's going to be included in the single video, so make sure that you use the chapters below in order to skip to the parts that you need. You can download the starter project from the description below, and when you open it up or import it, you should have something that looks like this. We have a single room and just basically the assets that we're going to be using in the game. Now let's get started by actually renaming our initial room to rm_init. This is going to be responsible for initializing our game. If we open it up, let's check out the properties of the room. You can see that we have a width of 640 and a height of 480. And I also want to point out that I'm not using any viewports, as you can see that they are not enabled and viewport 0 has been left unchecked. Now, the one thing that I do want to do is I want to add a new object and want to call this object object_init game. For the object, let's add a single event and let's make sure it's the create event. Now, this object is going to be responsible for loading up our game. The first thing I want to do is actually load the default values. Also, because I have some randomization in my game, I'm going to make sure that I use the randomize function within here. The next thing I want to do is load up some global variables. I'm going to use a pipe speed and set this to 2, and now I'm also going to include a pipe count and set this as 0. We could be using the built-in score variable, but I feel it's necessary to use our own variables in case those are taken away. Now, after our defaults have been put in place, normally this is where we would load our user data. However, this game just doesn't have any. You could take it a step further and add in some high score, but I'm going to be leaving that out. The final thing that this object is going to be doing is going to a splash screen or a menu. We can do this with the room_goto command, and the room that we want to go to is one that we haven't created yet, but it is called rm_menu. Now that we're done with this object, let's actually go back to the room and make sure that we add the object into the instances layer. Now let's create a new room by right-clicking, and we'll say new room, and let's name this one rm menu. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that your starting room or rm_init needs to have this little house icon that represents the first room that's going to be loaded up. If that's not the case, you can click on the icon and we get this nice little window where we can drag the rooms around. We want to make sure that the rm_init is going to be at the top. Now, let's switch over to the room menu. The first thing I want to do is I want to change the background. We can find that in our assets, and we'll just apply the background here. Next, we're going to make a new layer in our room. We want to make sure that we're using the assets layer. With the asset layer selected, we'll go over to our sprites, and in the menu, let's grab our title, and we can just hold down the Alt key on Windows, and we can paste this within the asset layer. While we're still in the asset layer, let's grab one of our pipe graphics, and we'll place it at the bottom. We'll take a copy of the pipe graphic and let's rotate it 180 degrees and we'll put it at the top of our game. This is looking pretty good, but the next thing that I want to add is our character. So we're going to grab the sprite for the character and we're just going to place it in. Now this particular sprite is animated, so you can see here that we have an animation speed of 1. And you can change that however you want. The next thing that we need are going to be 2 buttons, one to allow us to play the game and one to quit the game. Let's create a new object called object menu button play. And we'll create the second object called object menu button quit. We'll start with the quit button by adding the sprite found within the assets. And now we want to add a new event. We're going to be adding a mouse event, and we want a left press event. The code for this is going to be pretty simple. We are just going to be using the game_end function, and this is a built-in function that will quit the game using Windows, Linux, or Apple. Now for the play button, let's change the graphic like we did before. Let's also add another mouse event, and let's add the left press event. This event needs to do a little bit of work. The first thing that we need to do is reset the pipe counter to 0. The reason we're doing this is because we're going to use this button later on in our game, and we don't want the player to have a continuous pipe count. The final thing that we're going to be doing is just loading up a new room, and we're going to go to the rm_game room, which we'll create in a second. Now let's save our object and create the rm game room underneath our rooms. Now, back in the editor for the room menu, we'll add in our 2 buttons. Let's also take a little bit of time to organize our objects here. Let's create a new group underneath objects and name this menu, and we'll grab the button objects and we'll just drag and drop them into this new group. Now we can test our game by running it, and you can see that we're sitting in the room menu here. So if I just click the quit button and I'm on Windows, you can see that the game automatically ends. This is perfect, this is what we want. Now if I run my game again, but this time I click on the play button, you'll notice that the screen goes black. And that's because we're in the rm_game room, which we really haven't done anything with yet. So everything is working as is. Let's close our game and go back to GameMaker. Now let's create a new object, and we're going to rename it to object character. Now before we move on, let's actually make sure that we add this object into the room so that we don't forget it. Now we can close the room, and back in the object, let's add a create event, and we're also going to add a step event. In the create event, we're going to tell this object not to animate. For this, we're going to change our image speed, and we're going to set this to 0. Next, we're going to be using a boolean to tell us whether or not we're able to flap our wings, meaning that we're going to fly upwards. Let's create this variable as is flapping, and we're going to set this to false. We also need a way to determine if we have died. We basically don't want to allow the user to flap their wings or collect the points if our character has died. We'll use this boolean to solve that for us. Next, we'll set a gravity variable. This is going to be different than the built-in gravity because we're not going to rely on those variables as they could be removed in the future versions. Now with our gravity variable, let's set it to something very low like 0.2. Next, we're going to need a new variable to store how much we can be pushed upwards when we flap our wings. Let's call this variable fly power. We're going to actually set this variable to our global multiplied. We're actually going to set this variable to our gravity multiplied by 25. Now, because of the way that GameMaker works, we also want this fly power to be a negative value. The easiest solution for this is just to add a negative sign in front of our equation. Next, let's use a variable to store our movement speed. We're going to call this a vertical movement, and we're going to set this to begin at 0. We also don't want our bird to fall down super fast. So we're going to be using another variable called vertical max to limit how fast our bird can fall. Let's set that to 16. Now over in the step event, the first thing that we always want to happen is to add gravity to our vertical movement. Next, we can check to see if our user has pressed anything on their keyboard by using a VK any key. Our next check we want to have happen is to see whether or not we are allowed to flap our wings by checking the boolean. If we are allowed to flap our wings, let's set our is flapping to true so that we cannot flap them again in rapid succession. We also want to ensure that our image index or subframe is set to 0. This is going to be the beginning of our animation. Finally, we also want to override the vertical movement with our fly power. This is going to instantly send our bird upward regardless of how fast they were falling down to begin with. Next, we want to have our animation play when we flap our wings. And when the animation is finished, we're going to reset everything. So the first thing, let's check to see if we're flapping our wings. If we are flapping our wings, let's set the image speed back to 1. This will cause our image to animate. Next, we need to check to see if we are on the last frame of our animation. We can do this by flooring the image index, which will always round down. We want to check this against the image number -1, which will be the last frame. Once we know we're on the last frame, let's set our is flapping to false and set the image index back to 0. On the flip side of everything, meaning that we're not flapping our wings, we are wanting to ensure that we cannot animate. So let's change the image speed to 0. And let's also set the image index back to 0 so that we're on the first frame. Now, before we add our vertical movement to our position, let's also clamp it using the vertical max. For this, we'll say vertical movement equals clamp. We'll pass in our movement speed. Then we want to clamp it based off of the negative value of vertical max and the positive value. Finally, what we need to do is add the vertical movement to our Y position. Now, if we run our game again and go and hit the play button, Now we can press any key on our keyboard and you can see that the bird is flying up and down. It doesn't matter how fast the bird is falling, as soon as we press the key, the fly power is going to take over and push our bird upwards. So with our character already done, let's close the game and create a new object. This object, I'm going to name it Object Pipe. Let's assign the pipe sprite, and let's check out the pipe sprite collision mask. If we open up the sprite and we come down to the collision mask, you can see that we have it set to precise slow. By default, if we left it on the rectangle here, you can see that you might collide with the pipe where there is actually no sprite. So to get around this, we'll just make sure that the collision type is set to precise. Now back inside the pipe, we are going to add a create event, a step event, and then we want to add an event where we collide with the character. We'll maximize the window and make sure that we're in the create event. In the create event, we're going to create a new variable called pipe speed. This is different than our global variable, but we're going to be assigning it the global variable. The reason we're doing it this way is because if we change the global variable, this pipe speed for this particular instance is not going to change automatically. Now to get this moving, all we have to do is go over to the step event and we'll say our x position is going to minus equal the pipe speed. Now to finish off the last event, which is our collision event, we want to check the other keyword. Remember, the other in this case is going to be our character. So we need to check to see whether our character has died, and we can do that with the isDead flag. So if our character is not dead, let's create a new instance, and we're going to have this at the room width divided by 2, the room height divided by 2. We'll use the same depth as our pipe object, and then we're going to spawn the play button, just so we can play again. Once we've spawned the button, outside of the if statement, we'll set our object bird, or the other keyword in this case, to say isDead is true. Now let's switch over to our character, because if our bird dies, we don't want any actual interaction with the user happening. Inside the step event, we could check to see if we are dead. And if we are dead, we don't really care about clamping the speed. We'll actually add the vertical movement onto our Y position, and then we'll change our sprite to be the SPR character dead sprite, and then we'll have an early return. This early return means that anything below is not going to be able to be run, so we're not going to be checking for any key presses or anything like that. Let's open up our room and add a pipe here, and let's also add another pipe which we're not going to be really able to avoid. If we run our game, you can see here we'll go and we'll start flapping, and whenever we hit the second pipe, you can see that we get that play button. We're not able to do anything with our character, they just kind of fall down, and once we hit the play button, we can just play the game once again. Now in the original Flappy Bird, we didn't have pipes that looked like this. One pipe was down and the other pipe kind of was swung around like this, and then they would move from the right to the left. So we're going to create an object that is going to spawn these pipes in position. We'll remove them from our game, and let's close our room and create a new object. We'll call this object pipe spawner. We're going to have an create event and also an alarm 0. Now because we're going to be using alarms, I'm going to write a little helper function here. Let's create a new script, and we'll call this one get seconds. This script is going to accept a value, which is going to be the number of seconds we want. What we're going to do is return the function GameGetSpeed. We're going to pass in the FPS type and then multiplied by the value. This means that if we were to pass in the value of say 10, this would return 10 seconds. If we change the value from 10 to 3, it would give us 3 seconds. So with this function done, we could use the alarm set function, and we'll set alarm 0 and we'll say get seconds 5. So in 5 seconds, alarm 0 is actually going to be ran. So inside alarm 0, once the initial pipes have been created, we want to create new pipes every 3 seconds. So we could just copy and paste the code and change get seconds to 3. So to get our pipes spawning, at the very top of the alarm, let's create a temporary variable for x. This is going to be the room width plus 48 so that these pipes are going to spawn off screen. The y position is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be using an I random range between two values. However, let's go over to the create event and create a new variable. We're going to be using this as kind of a helper variable. This variable is called minimum pipe distance. We're going to set this minimum pipe distance to 128. You can play with this number however you want, but this is going to be the distance between the bottom pipe and the top pipe. So switching back over to the alarm 0, the random range is going to be in between the minimum pipe distance and the room height minus the pipe distance. Now I do want to point out that I do have the room width in here, but you should be using the room height. It's something that I'll have to fix later on. Now we need to instantiate each individual pipe. For the first pipe, we're going to be using the instance create depth at the X and Y position. Again, the depth here doesn't matter, so we'll just use the same depth as our spawner. Now we're going to spawn the object pipe. We can copy this code and paste it below to actually instantiate the second pipe. We don't need to use the word var here because we've already created the variable, so we don't need to do it again. Now the key here when instantiating the second pipe is we need to minus the Y position with our minimum pipe distance to move it upwards. Once we've moved the pipe up, we'll take the pipe instance and we'll change the image angle by adding 180 degrees and therefore flipping it upside down. So our initial player will have 5 seconds to figure out the controls, and then every 3 seconds, as you see here, the alarm is going to reset and instantiate new pipes. Let's go back over to our game room and just add the pipe spawner in. Now when we run our game and we play it, after the initial 5 seconds, the pipes will start to spawn in, and you can see here our bird needs to fly through these individual pipes. Once we hit one of the pipes, our play button comes up and we can easily just play again. So the key concept of our game is done, except we don't have any way to tell when we've flown through these individual pipes. For this, we're going to create a new object. Let's call this object pipe collection, and we're going to assign the pipe collection sprite. If we take a look at the sprite, you can see it's pretty simple. It's just a regular sprite that has a regular rectangle for collision, and we are going to expand this all the way across the pipe to tell us when we've actually flown through each pipe. Let's add a create event, we'll add a begin step, and then a draw event. The last event that we want is going to be a collision with our object character. Now let's maximize the window, and let's add our first variable, and this will be a follow target. We're going to use this to tell it which pipe to follow or which group of pipes to follow along with. Over in the begin step, we're going to make sure that our follow target does not equal none, meaning that we do have a target to follow. Once we know that we have a target, all we're going to do is update the X position to be the same X position as our target. Now, if we collide with our object player, we first need to check to see if we are dead. Because we can't score points if we're dead, so let's check to see if the other is dead is equal to false. So this means if we aren't dead, we can increase our global pipe count, and then we'll say destroy instance. Remember, this destroy instance is not destroying the player, but it's actually destroying our collection. So now we need to actually go back to the object spawner, and inside the alarm, we're going to instantiate a new collection here. For this, we'll create a new variable called instance collection, and again, we'll use the instance create depth. Here, we want to use the same X position, but for the Y position, we're going to use the Y position minus the minimum pipe distance divided in half. This means that the collector is going to be put in the middle of the pipes. Next, we're going to have to tell the instance collection which target to follow, and it can just be the instance pipe from above. The final thing that we're going to need for the instance collection is I want to change the image Y scale, and I want to scale this up a bunch, let's say by 100 just to be safe. This is going to cover the entire pipe, so whenever our player flies through the middle, it will know that automatically we're going to hit it so that we can collect those points. Now if we run our game and we look at the pipes, you can see that we're not actually drawing anything, so it's a little hard to see. So for debugging purposes, we'll switch back, and over in the draw event, let's add the draw self command for the pipe collection. Now if we run the game again, and once we've hit our maximum amount of seconds, you can see here that our pipes are appearing, and we also have the collection sprite. Once we go through the pipes and hit the collection sprite, the collection automatically is taken away. Now you're going to have to trust me, but our pipes are being counted. We're just not actually viewing them on the screen. So let's close our game and let's create a new object called Object UI. We'll add a single event for the draw graphical user interface or draw GUI. And in here, we're just going to draw some text. We'll use the X position of 10 and the Y position of 10 for the location. What we're going to output is just the score. We're going to be using a $sign so that we can interpolate everything in here. And we're going to pass in the global pipe count. Now, the only thing I want to do is I want to change the color to say C black because of our background, and then I'll reset it to C white below. Now, if you don't like changing the colors, the other thing we could be using here is a draw text color, so we don't have to worry about resetting the color afterwards. All we have to do is append the C black onto each one, and then the alpha on the end. Now let's go to our game room and add the object in. Let's also switch to the background, and let's add our background in here as well. Now, the one thing I want to do for our background is I'm going to change the speed of the background to say -2, and I want to make sure that we tile this horizontally. Now let's run our game again and hit play, and you can see that our character is flying. We have the background moving. We are not drawing the collection sprites. However, when we fly through the collection sprites, you can see that our score is going up. If we hit one of those pipes, you can see that we instantly die. We get that play button. And then when we click play again, our score is reset to 0. And that brings this tutorial to an end for a clone of Flappy Bird. If you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe, and you can check out the Patreon channel for more tutorials or text tutorials, as well as access to Discord and, among other things, the software and source code. A special shout out to Patreon supporters in no particular order: Patrick, Aldo, Sapike, Thomas, Sean, Emerald, Helena, 39 Digits, Matthew, Mika, Midnight, GameMaker Community, GGB84, and Victor. Once again, thank you for watching. I hope you like what you see. Don't forget to subscribe and share the channel to help out. I'll see you in the next one.